All right. So thanks everyone for inviting me and for coming to my talk. So bear with me just a second as I organize my screen. All right, I think I'm sharing now and you should be seeing me. I'd appreciate if somebody would confirm that.
Yes, we can see.
Wonderful. All right, so I'm going to talk about ablation-cooled laser material processing as already announced. Ömer İlday from Bilkent University, and I thank the OSA chapter for organizing this talk. So I'm going to talk about laser material processing, and this is obviously one of the most important applications of lots of different types of lasers, in particular fiber lasers, which have grown in importance tremendous in the last couple of decades. In fact, going beyond just fiber lasers, some sort of material processing, which usually involves some sort of material cutting, is one of the earliest applications of lasers. One of my favorite quotations in this regard is this paper by one of the inventors of the laser, Gordon Gould, that dates to 1961, just about when the first lasers were being demonstrated, already talking about physiological implications of laser beams. Most of the article was concerned about accidental damage by lasers, but also it was pointing towards important biomedical applications. In fact, only within 2 years after this, the first medical application of a laser was demonstrated. I think that's fantastic progress, going within 2 to 3 years from laboratory demonstration to actual medical application. And since then, laser material processing has blossomed tremendously. Now it's a multi-billion-dollar industrial market, as well as bearing a lot of interest and demonstrating a lot of applications in the medical direction. Here you can see just a few demonstrations of laser processed materials, which can be in the form of cutting or shaping a material, or changing the surface texture of various materials to control their different properties, or doing the best and finest kind of 3D printing like demonstrated here or here. In particular, when using ultra-fast laser pulses, meaning pulses that are shorter than a few picoseconds and typical in the femtosecond duration, you get a level of control, uniformity that is simply not possible with other laser material interactions. In fact, all of the demonstrations on this slide were achieved with ultra-fast laser pulses. In fact, ultra-fast ablation is based on generating very high energy, very high peak power pulses using the technique called chirp pulse amplification, which basically involves stretching the pulses along the time domain, amplifying them with relatively low peak power so they don't damage the laser system itself, and then compressing them outside of the laser via relatively safe methods. And this was actually invented by Gerard Moreau, who also, along with Donna Strickland, invented the chirp pulse amplification. That was the Nobel Physics Prize from 2 years ago. I'm sure all of you have heard about this. Now, I'll tell you a few things that may come a little bit surprising to you. First, I think you all know about how ultra-fast laser ablation is really good. I already emphasized this point. Here are some dramatic examples on metals, on thermally sensitive tissue, and semiconductors like silicon. But I will ask the following question. If it is so great, why is that still relatively niche application? Today, there are thousands of lasers deployed worldwide in lots of different applications. As I said, it's a multi-billion-dollar market. But among these, ultra-fast lasers are a tiny, tiny minority. Most of laser material processing is done with high-power lasers producing continuous beams, so-called as CW or continuous wave lasers. Less commonly, but still far more commonly than ultra-fast lasers, we have relatively short pulse lasers called nanosecond lasers. And then as a far third comes ultrafast lasers. If ultrafast is so great, I think it's a very legitimate question to ask why that is such a minority. Well, reality is ultrafast is great, but it's also very expensive, slow, and inefficient by comparison. And in today's talk, I'm going to describe how we are really beginning to change the slowness and the inefficiency factors, aspects towards the better. And I'm not going to talk about it, but our demonstrations have implications for reducing the cost of these lasers in the future as well. So to give you an idea about the relative expense, I'll share this information with you. Today, a few kilowatt laser can be had for several tens of thousands of US dollars, whereas, so that works to about $10 per watt. Whereas a femtosecond commercial laser works to about 100 times more expensive on a per watt basis. So there are relatively few applications that can handle these very much larger expenses, even though the quality afforded by femtosecond lasers is clearly superior. Now here's one of my favorite movie scenes from my favorite James Bond movie, The Goldfinger from 1964. In this movie, the villain, Goldfinger, is threatening to cut our favorite spy, James Bond, into two. So there's this little cute demonstration of a laser slicing through a very thick metal plate. And in the movie, actually, the metal plate doesn't seem to really get very warm, even though it's being cut. This thick frame is being cut by the laser. Mr. Bond is not feeling any discomfort. Today, you can actually cut even thicker pieces of metal with speeds that are similar to those demonstrated in the movie, but in doing so, you'd be warming up the entire piece very significantly to the level that Mr. Bond wouldn't be so comfortable on it at all. So it is as if the movie makers at the time had a femtosecond laser in their minds. With a femtosecond laser, you can really localize the heating to the immediate vicinity of the parts being cut, and you can manage to keep the rest of the metal very cool. But taking as basis demonstrated femtosecond laser cutting speeds until recently, if you were to imagine really doing this scenario, I've calculated that it would take about 100 years to cut Mr. Bond with a femtosecond laser. It's that slow. It's many, many orders of magnitude slower than what is depicted in the movie or what you can do with a CW laser beam nowadays. So this actually begs the question, why is it really slow and inefficient? And in fact, the result is fairly fundamental. It's because of the so-called Beer-Lambert law, which governs how light is being absorbed by any material. So here's a rough plot, a cartoonish plot, showing the absorbed power or the fluence or energy per unit area, starting with the surface, outer surface of the material, and then showing how that absorbed energy decreases as it goes deeper inside the material. The characteristic behavior is that of an exponential function. And really, therein lies your problem. I'm going to simplify considerably, but basically what I'm saying is quite accurate. When I say that ultrafast removal of a material, the so-called ultrafast ablation process, basically occurs if the locally deposited energy or the local temperature exceeds a certain critical value. Let's say that critical value or threshold value is indicated by this line here. So if it were placed like this, then you'd be removing material down to the intersection of that line with this line corresponding to this particular ablation depth. So if you wanted to, cut deeper into the material, you would be getting down to this level. You could increase the laser power. Why does my slide not work? All right, very good. But basically, here's what's happening. Here's what you're suffering with. To really remove this material down to this depth, you needed to provide the energy within this blue square. But in reality, you have to have this tail, pretty long tail, where you have heated the material still to very high temperatures, but you are the level is below the threshold, so the material isn't going to be ablated, and this heat will have to diffuse into the bulk of the material by the time the next pulse comes in. Otherwise, it will start heating the material, which is exactly what you want to avoid with a femtosecond pulse. And then there is this chunk here, there's this chunk here that is excess energy for the amount of the material that will be ablated, which will basically show up as excess kinetic energy as the material gets ejected. Very well, very nice, but it's not really so important for you. So out of this overall shape, pretty much you needed to deposit only this energy, but you ended up depositing these huge chunks of energy. Roughly, that's about a third. The best you can do is about a third, in fact, a little bit less than that. Well, as I said, you have to also ensure that this leftover heat diffuses away completely by the time the next pulse arrives. Otherwise, as we have demonstrated in this very simple experiment, you're going to heat up the material. And if it's a temperature sensitive material, like human dentine in these two pictures, you're going to start thermally damaging it, even if you're using femtosecond pulses. So here we do a very fair comparison on same dentine sample with the same laser, same pulse duration, focusing optics, scanning, etc. Everything is identical. On the left, we do this at a repetition rate of 1 kilohertz. So we have pulses of certain energy hitting the material 1,000 times per second. On the right, 25 times faster, 25,000 pulses hitting the material per second. Now, normally we would get 25 times faster ablation here, but you see, because of this deposited leftover heat energy not being able to diffuse away fast enough, we get horrible carbonization of the dentine, even though we are using femtosecond pulses. So the traditional approach to avoid this problem has been to operate with very high pulse energies, such that almost everywhere along this curve, you're exceeding the threshold fluence comfortably, such that there's relatively very little energy left over as excess heat. So it will be easier to get rid of this to ensure that it doesn't really accumulate. But the problem is that, first, now you're wasting a huge amount of your pulse energy, basically going into excess kinetic energy, which doesn't really do you any good. And second, if you were to increase this threshold, pulse energy, thereby decreasing the threshold like this, the amount of material you're going to ablate, with this rectangle that's getting thinner and longer, scales terribly. It actually scales logarithmically because of the exponential absorption curve, and the amount of ablated material, volume or depth-wise, will increase only as a logarithmic function of your pulse energy. That's about the worst scaling you can have. So you have the issue of either being limited to very low pulse repetition rates, which limits your speed, or being extremely efficient, and commonly both. So this is the problem, and it's because of basically the fairly fundamental law of the Beer-Lombard absorption profile. So that's the backdrop. And a number of years ago, we started asking the following question, motivated by other work, where we seek collective interactions of pulses with different materials for a wide variety of different results, most of it having to do with self-organization, self-assembly, and related topics. But basically, we asked the following question. How about if we went exactly to the opposite direction that I told you that people try to go to, which is to increase the pulse energy so you're far above the threshold and operating at relatively low repetition rates? What if we actually decided to reduce the pulse energy and increase the pulse frequency tremendously, so much so that between subsequent pulses we send, there's so little time that the heat doesn't diffuse at all? So the traditional approach was to let the pulses come in very infrequently, such that the accumulated heat completely diffuses away. And we wanted to take the exact opposite direction and send the pulses so fast that there's negligible diffusion between the pulses. Now, here's a cartoon of what happens if you do that. We are still bound by the same Beer-Lambert law, obviously, but now I'm sending much lower pulse energies, in fact, far lower than indicated in this cartoon, but to make it visible, I'm showing you about this scale. Our pulse in this picture barely exceeds the threshold and ablates a tiny bit of material. But very, very quickly after that, I sent another pulse, during which the heat left over by the previous pulse doesn't have a chance to diffuse away. So it is still where it was a moment ago. And then the second pulse chips away a little bit more of the material. And immediately after that, I sent another pulse, going on like this, not with about the 20 pulses that I'm showing in this cartoon, but we do this with thousands of pulses, in fact, tens of thousands of pulses. Then, as you can also get an idea from this cartoon, we get an overall profile that's actually much closer to this ideal square. And this is with too many pulses. With about 10,000 pulses, we are getting really very close to this square shape. That's the basic idea. Namely, the excess heat that didn't ablate the material left over by one pulse is still there by the time the next pulse comes in, and it will be removed, ablated by that pulse. So I've shown you how it works along or into the laser material, into the surface. Let me show you this overall picture where I will also explain what happens along the lateral direction. So I send in a certain pulse, it ablates this thin disk. And if you look at the numbers, that's actually pretty key. The thickness of the disk is much less than a micron. The width is typical 20, 30, 40, 50 microns. So this is really a very, very thin pancake or very thin dough. So much so that heat diffusion immediately after the pulse is practically a planar wave into the material. And the diffusion along the sides is tiny because this area of the sides of this disk compared to its overall plane is negligibly small. So we send the pulse, ablate a little bit of material, heat starts diffusing essentially as a plane wave into the material. Then the next pulse comes in. The next pulse ablates large portion of the heat left over by the previous pulse, which also leaves a little bit of excess heat. But then the next pulse comes in and sweeps that away. The ejected material goes out in the air and the heat energy together with it. So basically, we are really chasing after the heat. We are going so fast that leftover heat, doesn't really have a chance to escape from the laser beam. So that's the key idea. And in fact, if you think of it in more general terms, we are really converting what was essentially an isolated interaction of a single pulse by the material, and then a practically infinitely long time passes before the next pulse comes in and the whole process is repeated. Here, with this very high repetition rates, we intend for all of the pulses to interact collectively with the material. Although the pulses obviously don't come simultaneously, but come one at a time, they essentially talk to each other by the temporal profile, temperature profile, thermal profile that they create within the material. So what I've told you in qualitative terms can be put into a very simple toy model, which the essence of which is summarized here. I'm not going to go through the math, but I'm going to point out a few salient features to you. And while I'll do that, let me show you here also a plot. There is a full complex numerical simulation of the same scenario. And the toy model is really a toy version of what's going on here. And the basic idea is that the material gets ablated only if the temperature increases above a critical temperature, which I'm showing as this T sub C here. T sub 0 is the environmental local temperature, independent of the pulses. After that, the heat that you left behind starts diffusing away, initially with a profile that goes with the 1 over the square root of a constant plus the time that passes. And here, T0, tau 0 is the terminal relaxation time. Now, this varies from material to material, but it's roughly in the range of a few nanoseconds, even for high conductivity materials. Whereas tau r here is the time between the pulses determined by the repetition rate of the laser pulses. Traditionally, people worked with sub-megahertz repetition rates, so time between the pulses was in the range of microseconds, even as long as milliseconds. We went up to above a gigahertz, in fact, recently up to about 100 gigahertz. So time between the pulses is now measured in units of picoseconds. And then many pulses are being sent, let's say a total of n number of pulses. The first n pulses, because their energies are so low, don't really even manage to ablate anything, but they accumulate heat on the surface. And there's almost no time between the pulses, so there's almost no diffusion between the pulses, so heat really quickly accumulates. The material reaches the critical temperature for ablation, and then every subsequent pulse succeeds in ablating the material. So every pulse that comes in the strain really builds upon the results of the previous pulses. It finds a very hot surface that is practically almost at the critical temperature. But because so little time passes between the pulses, and because each pulse practically removes the new heat added by the previous pulse, there is almost perfect localization of the heat energy from the strain of pulses. If you put this very simple analytical model into action, you get a few important conclusions. So our first claim was what I already told you in words, that the residual leftover heat is going to be carried away by the ablation process caused by the subsequent pulses. And in fact, so much so that at the limit of the time between the pulses going towards 0, we expect residual heating of the rest of the material, the bulk of the material, to be vanishing. The second claim is that because these pulses collectively prepare the surface for ablation and collectively build upon on each other, the ablation threshold can be indefinitely lowered if you also increase the number of pulses, which means you can use very low pulse energies, which in turn makes the laser design so much simpler. The third claim is that now, because the pulses are collectively interacting with the material, and each pulse, one after another one, is chipping the material away, the ablation depth increases linearly with the number of pulses, or linearly with the total energy we deposit into the system, instead of logarithmically. So I'm going to now show you how we proved all three of these claims. But before that, I'll answer a question that I often get asked, and I think it's a nice story, namely where the term ablation cooling is coming from. Well, I like science fiction. I love reading science fiction, and we've done this work, we've thought about this work without knowing the concept of ablation cooling. And one night I was reading a book called Ring World by Niven. If you haven't read it, it's an excellent book. And if, in fact, this was pretty close to the submission of the paper. And there in it, I read the following passage. It must have been ionized plasma in the first seconds. A meteorite can be cooled by ablation by the boiling away of its own skin. And as soon as I read these words, I said, oh, this sounds so very much like what we are doing. And next morning, I looked into this. In fact, it turns out that ablation cooling is a very well-known technique, and it's used to thermally protect basically any spacecraft that's designed to re-enter the atmosphere since 1950s. And again, by chance, a few weeks later, I was attending the APS meeting in the US and in Baltimore, and we took a day trip to Washington, D.C., and we went to the Smithsonian Museum. And there I found this exhibition. I took its picture. You see, this is actually the first ablation cool, or one of the first ablation cooling examples. This is actually a shield of the Gemini spacecraft that's designed to be sacrificial, that's designed to ablate and remove heat from the surface, protecting the inner parts of the material. This is the burnt or ablated charred part of it. Now, I looked into it some more. It turns out this idea, which we independently discovered, had turned from science fiction to science twice. Once by our work, but second, it turns out that the original idea of ablation cooling in rocket science comes from an earlier science fiction book, 1934 book called Triplanetary. So, interesting coincidence. Anyway, now I will show you our proofs of the three main claims. First one was that by removing this material, by the ablation process, we are literally reducing the temperature of the material momentarily and carrying away the heat. We wanted to show a direct proof of this, and here is the experiment we came up with. We took two thermoelectric modules. So thermoelectric modules have the property that if you create a temperature difference between its two surfaces by the Peltier effect, you can measure or you can register a voltage difference between the two surfaces. So we decided to use one of the modules as the target to be ablated. We focused the beam. So here is the target module. The laser beam is coming from the top, gets focused here. Oops. But it passes through a microscope slide that's suspended about 1 millimeter above the surface, which itself is attached to a second thermoelectric module. And then during the process, we monitored the voltage difference we read for these two thermoelectric modules, which gives us a signal proportional to their temperature differences. And we repeated the experiment for the two cases of very low repetition rate pulses and very, very high repetition rate pulses. Average power and etc., everything was exactly the same, like in the Dentine experiment, or similar to the Dentine experiment. But in one case, we sent groups of pulses at gigahertz repetition rates. In the other case, the pulses were uniformly spaced with a kilohertz repetition rate. What we found, as you can see from in here, in the red case shows what we get with low repetition rate, so negligible ablation cooling. The target material heats up a lot and then cools down. And then this second module doesn't heat up too much. When it does heat, why does it heat? Because we have ejected material, and some of this ejected material sticks to this glass slide, and this glass slide heats up the lower surface of the second module, which we then measure or probe with the temperature difference, with the voltage difference. However, when we increase the repetition rate of the pulses, then we get into this blue case where the target material heats up much less, even though it actually gets ablated far more, and the glass slide gets heated up much more because of all the ejected material sticking and heating it. So this constituted a direct proof of the fact that at these very high repetition rates, we have more ablation, and as a result of more ablation, the target material heats up much less than it would have if it weren't ablating that fast. And this ejected material itself carries significant energy, which we can measure directly. All right, the second claim was that the ablation threshold is reduced, and this is really great for laser technology, but I'll show you first the results. Here, this is for silicon, I think, but we've done it for different materials. Oh yes, this is for silicon. We've got very similar graphs for copper and several different materials. What you're seeing on the vertical axis is the amount of material ablated per light incident, and the horizontal axis is the individual pulse energy. And the different colors represent different repetition rates, starting from traditional low repetition rates going up to multiple gigahertz values. As we increase the repetition rate, we decrease the individual pulse energy such that the total energy delivered to the system remains the same across these different plots. And when we plot the efficiency as a function of pulse energy, you see that even though we are going towards much lower efficiencies, pulse energies, the efficiency increases very significantly. So this proves that the ablation threshold is reduced and also that the efficiency increases. To provide additional evidence, we made further comparisons. This is a comparison with a result from the literature where people have used a different type of laser operating at low repetition rates and have gotten the following ablation rates per pulse energy, or in this case, pulse fluence, that's energy per unit area, for also copper. Compared to that, our results are literally off the charts. So our individual pulse energy falls to somewhere around here. So we get about 10,000 times better efficiency. And even if you consider all of the pulses, the great many pulses that we send, as if they were a single pulse, even then we are 10 times better in efficiency than this result we were comparing against. And the final claim was that we get a linear scaling behavior in this regime as a result of this collective interaction. This result you've seen before, establishing the logarithmic scaling. Note that this is a semi-log plot. And here's our results. The depth is shown as a linear function of the fluence. Note the values. Here we're talking about 40 micron. Here it's like 200 nanometers. And we get basically perfect linear scaling all the way across this wide range of values, which are almost 100 times larger than these values here. Here is one of these, in fact, this point image like this. So this is done by a single shot, single burst consisting of thousands of pulses that has dug a hole that's almost 40 micron deep inside silicon while creating negligible deformation or debris on the rest of the surface. You see, it's extremely well localized. Now let's go back to the ablation regime's implications for the future for materials, and let's focus on what I think will be a very, very important topic in the near future, which is applications to laser surgery, because this is one area where you really don't want to allow any heat to accumulate on the material, but where you desperately need to go to higher speeds. So first, we did a series of fair comparisons, first on mouse brain tissue. Here, what I mean by a fair comparison is that we operate the same laser in two modes. In the traditional mode, it produces pulses which are equidistantly spaced in time. In the other case, in the ablation-cooled regime, we group the pulses into so-called bursts, a group of pulses, let's say 100 or 10 or 100 pulses or thousands of pulses, which have very, very high repetition rate in between them, very small temporal separations. But overall, the pulse energies, pulse durations, and the average powers and the processing time on the material is identical. So from a thermodynamics point of view, the total amount of energy and the rate at which we deliver it is exactly identical. And here are some of the results. So this is for brain tissue. We ablate the tissue and then we make histological cuts and analyze how much, if any, there was thermal damage on the material. So in the traditional regime of the same laser at about 600 milliwatts of average power, so it's not terrible, but we get a significant section, as you can see, where as part of the tissue is detached and it's partially heat damage, as indicated by this dark color. Whereas in the ablation-cooled regime, we get this beautiful cut with no sign of damage to the underlying cellular structure here. And then we increase the average power to about 3 watts of average power. In the traditional regime, we can't use this power. We'd have to aggressively cool the tissue because it starts burning. But in the ablation-cooled regime, we were able to get this beautiful cut, again, with basically no discernible heat damage to the material, and at what it was at the time, record-breaking speeds of several millimeter cube per minute. So now let me tell you why this is a big deal from a potential applications point of view. Well, you probably heard of laser surgery for the eye, LASIK. There, femtosecond lasers are already being used, but this is a very specialized application where you need to address an absolutely tiny microscopic volume of tissue. You want to be very careful and avoid any thermal damage, but this can be adequately done in the traditional regime. But there's a vast range of medical applications where you would want to be cutting tissue, maybe removing tumors or doing other types of laser cutting, while being very careful not to damage surrounding tissue. Well, the problem is, as I indicated in the fun slide on the James Bond movie, in principle, you can do this. You could do this before our work too, but it would take many, many hours. So it's just not feasible. Very few applications of ultrafast lasers in the medical area have been demonstrated, basically for this reason. A very interesting application direction is for dentistry. Here, the idea is that instead of using the very crude technology of a fast rotating drill bit to drill away dental parts of tooth, which is forming micro cracks, heating the dentine substantially. That's why water is being sprouted on the tooth, so on and so forth. You could do this in principle with a femtosecond laser beam. You wouldn't be heating almost anything if you did it right. And since there is no mechanical pressure, there is no pain for your neurons to register, so-called painless dentistry. But the problem is that if you did it prior to our work, with a femtosecond laser, the speeds were so low that it would take an hour to remove a cavity, which takes a few minutes with the dental drill. So there's a lot of motivation to really increase the speeds without causing any thermal damage. So our next demonstration was towards this application. Again, we made a fair comparison. First, let me show you nice results in the traditional regime. With 100 microjoule pulses at 1 kilohertz, you can make a really very nice cut, but it's very, very slow. If you then increase the repetition rate in the traditional regime, as I've shown you at the very beginning, you get terrible carbonization. If you, however, apply the same average power with the ablation-cooled regime with gigahertz pulses, we get this beautiful cut with no evidence of thermal damage to the material, no heat accumulation. And then we increase the speed even further, like in the brain tissue demonstration, and we achieved, by more than an order of magnitude, record-breaking speeds of 3 millimeter cube per minute, creating these beautiful cuts. Now, as nice as this sounds, and this was our best result at the time of the publication of our paper, this is still too low to make it really medically viable. But more recently, one of my PhD students managed to demonstrate almost 10 times higher speeds, reaching almost a millimeter cube per second. And now we are really talking about speeds that are medically relevant, that are getting comparable to what the dentist achieves with a dental drill bit. Incidentally, students, both of his parents and his sister were dentists. So I think he was very motivated to do this because of also familiar reasons as well. So here's a movie showing what I'm telling you in a very dramatic fashion. In the video above, you're seeing us using the traditional regime to try to remove a piece of dentine. And you can see smoke come. I hope you can see the resolution on your screens is good enough, but on my screen, I can see smoke coming out of this piece of dentine here. Whereas on the lower video, we are working on essentially identical piece of dentine with the same average power, and we are generating one of the best cuts, in fact, I think precisely this cut that you've seen here, and there's no thermal damage occurring on the material. All right, then Denison moved on, and he actually did something fantastic. He built a complete laser system, which was completely computer controlled and integrated to a special microscope, so-called an optical coherence tomography microscope. That's really interesting for eye surgery. And together with some doctors, we did initial demonstration on bovine cow eyes. And we've done essentially one of the basic steps used in LASIK surgery, which is the removal of a flap. So what you do is you make a vertical planar cut like this, basically create a wall, and the second one perpendicular to it. So here's the first wall, second wall, and this part is, you don't touch it, it remains attached. And with the tweezers, you remove this thin layer of tissue for the next step in LASIK treatment, which we didn't do, but we were able to demonstrate that this cut can be achieved using 25 times lower pulse energy, much higher speeds, and no sign of damage. All right, so I've shown you a number of, I think, very interesting, very motivating results. And these results were achieved by basically going from the range of about 100 kilohertz repetition rates, or even lower, to multi-gigahertz. In fact, some of the results I'm showing you were achieved with repetition rates as high as 50, 100 gigahertz. So how did we do that? That was, at the time when we had the idea, was a major problem, because if you actually consider multi-gigahertz repetition rates at about microjoule pulse energies that we thought we needed at the time, around 2011 or 12, which is when I originally had the ablation-cooled laser surgery material processing idea. If you multiply these two, that corresponds 1 gigahertz and 1 microjoule is 1 kilowatt of average power. So this is multi-kilowatt average power. That was absolutely impossible at the time for a femtosecond laser. Even today, it's actually extremely difficult. So we had the following idea of not generating these high repetition rates continuously, but making what I've been referring to as bursts of pulses. So the laser beam is initially off, then you turn it on, it generates many pulses. You see only about 10 of them here, but typically we would have thousands of them that are very close to space, relatively low energy, very close enough space that the repetition rate momentarily corresponds to multi-gigahertz. But then we turn the pulsation off only to repeat at the lower repetition rate. This break in between ensures that the total duty cycle is much less than 1, and the actual average power you need is then the average power you would need if you didn't use this technique times the duty cycle. And during our first demonstrations, the duty cycle was about 1 part in 1,000 or so. So instead of needing several kilowatt average powers, we needed only several watts of average powers, which was possible to achieve with the technology of 10 years ago. So to do this, we demonstrated the first burst mode lasers. Here's the very original paper. It took us several years to develop the technology. Over a number of papers, to get the performance that was good enough to obtain the results that you've seen so far. And later on, we continued increasing the capacity of these lasers to much higher average powers. So we didn't need to go to very low duty cycles, and that allowed us to increase the processing speeds and also allowed us to simplify the laser technology tremendously. And today now, this is really not a big deal technologically speaking anymore for us, and our duty cycles are above 10% levels. This, meanwhile, is now actually getting very broadly recognized worldwide. A number of people, a number of institutions are referring to this as a revolution. I've just chosen one web page from Amplitude Laser, which is one of the largest laser manufacturers, ultra-fast laser manufacturers, referring to it as a gigahertz revolution. So I'm not going to go and read this material, but I appreciate the very general endorsement by this company and many other people. So to sum up, I think this is actually a very good summary, a very pictorial summary. We've taken what was the state of the art for laser material processing. In terms of tissue processing, the top speeds prior to our work was about a 1/10 of a millimeter cube per minute, up to 3 millimeter cube per minute, and more recently up to 20 millimeter cube per minute. And we are now building a new generation of lasers, which I think will allow us to go up to far higher speeds. So this is a new physical regime, and like any new physical regime, it comes with a new scaling result. The ablation speed or ablation depth we get isn't scaling logarithmically with energy anymore, but it's actually scaling linearly. We achieve this fundamentally because now we have thousands, even tens of thousands of pulses interacting collectively with the target material. As a result, we've shown increases of efficiency from a very small fraction of a millimeter cube per minute per watt to more than several millimeter cube per watt per minute. So that translates to increase of efficiency of at least 10 to 100 times, in some cases more than 1,000 times. We increase the laser tissue cutting speeds by several hundred times, which now make our speeds as what you may regard as medically relevant. And in doing so, I didn't really focus on this aspect, but we managed to decrease the pulse energy required by much more than a factor of 1,000, in some cases by actually 100,000. And this motivates a paradigm shift in laser design. Even the burst mode lasers that we have originally developed are now outdated in my mind, and an entirely new generation of far simpler lasers are possible. Now, in summing up, I'd like to mention very quickly that there is a broader context to the idea behind this work, namely that we've been exploring collective laser material interactions driven by nonlinear feedback that occurs between the laser beam and the material with which it is interacting. They're outside of the context of today's talk, but I wanted to put a few of our references, the key references, over which these ideas have been exposed and developed over the past 10 years. And I'd like to conclude by acknowledging my numerous collaborators, one of whom is, or at least was in the audience at the beginning of this talk, present and past group members, again, several of them are here, and generous funding, especially from the European Research Council, but also from national funding from TÜBİTAK and SSM. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be very happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you for this excellent seminar. I have a question. Is there a physical limit to reducing the frequency of the pulses, or below the sub femtosecond laser level?
That's a very interesting question. I think you meant increasing the repetition, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
decreasing the time between the pulses. That's an ongoing investigation. There are clearly some fundamental limitations, but I think we're far from them. But what we do know is that as you decrease the pulse um, separation, you also decrease the pulse energy, and you have to maintain a certain amount of peak power to have sufficient nonlinear absorption, especially when dealing with transparent or semi-transparent materials, tissue largely being included in this category. So you would have to progressively go to shorter pulses as well. Assuming you do that, the results that I've shown you, I think, are still very far from the fundamental limits. There are certain limits, but I think we're not there yet. And I think it's a very, very interesting direction to explore these limits, which I can assure you that we are going to do.
I have another question before someone asks.
Please.
A couple of weeks ago, one of our professors also gave us a seminar about laser filamentation. And he also talked about some applications of that, which included eye surgery and brain surgery for tumor removal, like you also mentioned. I was wondering what are the advantages or disadvantages of this way you talked us about?
Well, I don't know which other talk you're referring to, so it's a little hard for me to comment. But filamentation is something that occurs under very similar conditions, so the two may not be mutually exclusive. And what I'm presenting to you is the general idea that you go to very, very high repetition rate, such that there is an interaction, nonlinear interaction between the pulses, in this case mediated by the stored or left over thermal energy within the system. So in principle, this whole idea can be applied to a number of other laser material interactions, which we've been doing recently, that do not even involve ablation. The key idea is the collective interaction. So I wouldn't see any reason why filamentation wouldn't be included. But since I don't know about this other talk, I'm not sure if I could say anything more concrete.
I was going to ask a similar question. That laser filamentation was from atmospheric propagation, and he mentioned, by the way, he works on plasma physics, as I know, so maybe it gives a clue. At that time I asked him to compare optical tweezer and that laser filamentation technique in surgeries, and he said laser filamentation is way more applicable and productive maybe than optical tweezer approaches. Now I want to ask, is this ablation-cooled laser cutting more productive, or maybe, I don't know, is this harm more, cause more?
Well, first, I don't think tweezer is even an application for cutting or removal of material. That's completely different. So,
actually, as I know, I mean, I'm not an expert, of course, I'm a student, but as I learned, they use the laser tweezer technique to control some microscopic blades, and so that they can do some surgeries.
I'm really not sure what you're talking about. Laser tweezers is for holding microscopic objects steady, like a single cell. And then if you hold it, then you can do something on the cell, perhaps with another laser or some other tool. But that's not really a technique for laser surgery at all. And I'm not really sure if laser filamentation is used commonly or at all for laser surgery. But laser ablation is the dominant mechanism of laser surgery. So that aspect is not new in our work. People have been using laser ablation for tissue surgery since forever. What we change is that we take this from the regime of each pulse interacting solo with the tissue to this collective interaction at very, very high speeds, both on part of the laser and in terms of laser surgery. So the closest example I would give you is LASIK surgery with femtosecond pulses. I mean, if you go to one of the eye hospitals in Ankara and have your vision corrected, it's very likely they will use a femtosecond laser on your eye. So that's a very established, very much currently in use technology. The problem with it, as I said earlier, while this works great for LASIK, where you need to remove minuscule microscopic amounts of material or process microscopic amounts of material, it's prohibitively slow for broader applications like removing a chunk of tumor, for example, where we'd be talking about many millimeter cubes, perhaps centimeter cubes of tissue. This is what we are interested in changing in the near future, because now we are achieving speeds that are actually significantly higher. It's still low, but it's getting to be medically relevant and interesting.
So can we say your approach is the most promising and productive approach for medical users? Is it?
I would think so. Yes, I certainly believe so.
Okay, that's great.
I might have a question allowed. Okay, I think thank you, Hocam, for the talk, and I wish you a happy New Year. Early happy
Thank
New
you.
Year.
You too.
Could you please go to the this linear result you achieved?
Sorry.
With
1 second.
tremendous advantage over the logarithmic scale link.
1 second. I'll stop. I accidentally stop sharing. Should be okay now, right?
Yes.
You wanted to see the linear versus logarithmic comparison, I think, right?
Oh, this is, yes, exactly this slide.
Mm-hmm.
So these blue dots, are they optimized using the equation you have shown previously, this thermo-optic-electric,
These dots are experimental results.
Yes, yes. I mean, for the experiment, do you have to optimize a set of parameters according to the equation you provided? Or is it?
Not really. I mean, you need to determine the individual pulse energy for given spot size. There's an optimal pulse energy. It's not terribly sensitive of a dependence, and that's about it. That's the basic optimization you do. You determine the pulse energy. So the ideal energy you would need, or optimal energy you would need, depends on the material, which basically depends on how linearly absorptive the material is, among other factors. But that's about it. And then generally speaking, the higher the repetition rate, the better, assuming you have short enough pulses.
So basically, for different materials, you have to use different energy densities.
Yes, basically you change the number of pulses within the burst, and this way you can control the amount of pulse energy per pulse. So the total, let's say you operate the laser as fixed power, let's say 100 watts of average power. For one material, you can send 1,000 pulses per group. In another material, you can set it to 2,000 pulses. For another material, you can set it to 10,000 pulses.
Thank you. And just a very short question is, what is the resolution if you want to have very small resolution?
That has nothing to do with our technique. It simply is determined by the spot size you're using. So in our case, the spot size is well, you can see it's typically around 10, 20, 30 micron. That's determined by the focusing lens that you use, right? I mean, that resolution has to do with how tightly you focus your laser beam. It has nothing to do with whether we use the ablation-cooled regime or the traditional regime.
Okay, thank you.
So I had a question. You kind of
Please.
mentioned it at the end of this question, but so the resolution for this is like 13 microns in the XY direction. I mean, would it be possible to create arbitrary shapes? I mean, by, I don't know, some kind of wavefront shaping, or I don't know. This is like the
Yeah, I think it's a good question. We tried a little bit. There's a lot of technical difficulties, and I don't think we really devoted much time into it. And in fact, we were motivated by something a little bit different. So it could be an interesting feature direction, but mainly when people do material processing, they're usually quite happy with 10, 20, in fact, even larger spot sizes, because the larger the spot size, the faster you can scan and cover a wider area. And usually speed is the key. And then the position of these holes is dictated by the beam position. And this beam is moved on the sample with very rapidly rotating mirrors, so-called galvanometric mirrors. And you can momentarily turn the beam on or off as you're jumping from one point to another. So typically what is done is that you scan a pattern, you define a pattern by programming the galvo scanner. So we can make any shape you want on the material, and I could print an image of your face profile, for example, obviously in just black and white mainly, process or don't process this point. That's what's normally is done. You scan over an area and you can scan an arbitrary pattern with the smallest spot being set by the laser focal, the laser beam at focus.
yeah, but if the resolution is enough, scanning is kind of enough, but scanning kind of slows down the whole process. So if you can somehow create whatever shape you want to create in the end by scanning, if you create the whole wavefront correspondingly, and
sure, you can do that. I mean, it's sort of again, it has nothing to do with our technique being used or not. You can do it with the traditional approach, and some people do such things. Also, what people do is oftentimes they divide the laser beam into 2, 4, or 8, and then they process in parallel. That's also something is done. But these are very technical applications, so we tend not to get so technical in what we do.
Thank you.
So this is more like something that a company would really develop.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Hocam, is this work, is this approach actively used in your laboratories right now?
Of course.
So you have projects, ongoing projects.
Ongoing projects, and I've been notified that we've been awarded a new ERC proof of concept grant too, which is not officially announced yet, but yeah, we'll be doubling down on this. So if anybody wants to join our team, please let me know. We'll be hiring.
Yes, I was going to ask if you would consider a joint project with other teachers. I mean,
Sure,
any
we've done
research.
it in the past very happily with Alpan Bek and Rashid Turan, and we'd be very happy to do it again in the future.
Okay, that's great. Hear that.
I mean, I haven't talked about this work, but some of the papers, at least one of them here, was a very active, beautiful collaboration with those two gentlemen. the number, which one? Number 4. Are there any other questions?
There are no other questions. Maybe I can ask one last question. I was thinking of asking over an email, but I'm so tempted to ask. I'm guessing
Please.
the spot size is limited by up to a micron roughly. Is that on the
Yeah.
order of the wavelength?
Basically, it depends on the lens or objective you use. For 1 micron light, the tightest you can focus is half a micron or so reliably.
Yes, yes. So I'm thinking of like a Venn scheme, like the set topic. When you have two circles that intersect, two circles that have an intersection in the middle, could this method with such temporal control and thermal control and so heat control, maybe we could come up with an idea to maybe not immediately, but have a method comparable to FIB. So very
Yeah.
small focused ion beam. Or
It's hard to compete with electrons in terms of focusability.
yes, yes, but
Keep in mind what we are doing ultimately is still thermal. So within the laser beam, the heat will still diffuse, right? Within the laser
exactly.
beam, it will be more or less uniformly heated. So it's very hard to imagine a Vernier-like scheme for going to higher resolutions.
But did you get what I mean by the intersection of two circles? When you make it 3 circles, that intersection will go smaller and smaller. So maybe with hard work, let's say, it could be possible to optimize the timing so that we could have the middle spot heated just a bit. It will be a really slow process, but it could be maybe just
Perhaps, but what happens is also that this ablation process is not instantaneous. And within this process, heat will still diffuse. And over such small subwavelength scales, essentially, I think any localization you can hope to get with the intersection of multiple circuits like this, that will likely be smeared out. So I'm not too optimistic about it, if I understand correctly what you're saying. I think if you were to tap into some sort of electronic nonlinearity, which is nearly instantaneous or something close to it, perhaps. In a sense, multiphoton microscopy does something similar, right? But even then, what you get is still limited by the diffraction limit for a wavelength corresponding to the actual wavelength you use divided by the order of the interaction. So if it's 2-photon microscopy, you still have the same limit as lambda over 2, half the wavelength that you're using. If it is 3-photon microscopy, you're more or less limited to lambda over 3,
exactly,
give or take.
So, I mean, we have half the evaporation or ablation power in one circle and half ablation power in one circle. And in the intersection, you will have only just enough energy to evaporate the middle part. That was the idea.
I think I get the idea. I'm not terribly optimistic,
Okay.
I have to say.
Okay, thank you.
I have another question.
Please.
A couple of weeks ago, I read an article and it was about focusing light through a scattering opaque media. At that article, they used a continuous wave laser.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if we can use femtosecond laser.
Absolutely. I think that's a very interesting idea for subsurface tissue processing, perhaps, right?
Yeah, I was gonna
Yeah.
ask that.
Yes, yes, I think so. Unfortunately, of course, they are still very much limited to about 1 millimeter or so depth. I
Yeah.
think this gets extremely interesting if anybody can figure out how to achieve that at the multi-centimeter depths, because then you can actually achieve, you can access a lot of medically very relevant, very interesting parts of the human body.
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, very interesting direction we imagine to combine our work with is magnetic resonance imaging, because there you can see deep into tissue with about 1 millimeter resolution. And if we had a way to deliver the light there successfully under MRI, under magnetic resonance imaging, we could ablate tissue selectively. We would be able to see what we're targeting and whether we ablated it successful or not under MRI. But at the moment, it's extremely challenging to send light below about 1 millimeter of laser of tissue.
I think I could get some keyword. You said inside the tissue. By saying that, do you mean we can go through the tissue without harming the surface?
Yes,
So we can,
because if you could arrange the focus line, if you don't focus the light, then we'd be below the ablation threshold, and you wouldn't be harming the tissue. If you look at human tissue, for a lot of the tissue, actually absorption is very little. We look opaque because we scatter, our tissue scatters light. If you had the same absorption in your body that you currently have, but if you had no scattering, you would look largely transparent, right? So the key enemy here is scattering. If you could find a way of undoing the scattering with wavefront engineering or some of these other innovative techniques, then you could send the light through tissue, focus to a desired point somewhere within your body, and let's say there's some cancerous tissue there, and you could target it from the outside without surgery, without open surgery, very selectively, very precisely. Unfortunately, that's a very difficult problem, the scattering problem. If you solve this problem, I can assure you you're going to stand on the podium in Stockholm one day.